The next projects that we're going to do are going to focus on the idea of drawing and seeing. As I talked about earlier, when we think about drawing, drawing is actually a learned skill. That learned skill is sometimes called sight measuring. So the idea that you can look at something and measure it with your eyes. As I mentioned in the earlier PowerPoint, this is something that drawing in the right side of the brain focuses on. The idea that you're trying to train your brain to see differently, to get it out of that symbol mode and put it into actually looking at the details of what you're trying to draw. You know, a lot of people, when they think about artists, they think you've been given a gift as an artist, that drawing is something that you're just born with. Well, drawing is a skill that you can learn. And sight measuring is a way that you can train your brain to process that information differently. As Betty Edwards says, drawing is a curious process, so intertwined with seeing that the two can hardly be separated. The ability to draw depends on the ability to see the way an artist sees. And this kind of seeing can marvelously enrich your life. So, beyond just this class, really being able to focus and look at something and the details of something is something that you can hold with you for the rest of your life. So, let's look at this image. How many of you see a vase? How many of you see two faces? How many of you can see both? What's happening here is the way that we look at something. When the pieces, whether we look at the edges of the face or we look at the edges of the vase. This idea is something called the perception of edges. It's one of the reasons that we started working on our blind contour line drawings, right? We were trying to perceive how different things are drawn. It's the same idea with our contour line drawings. We're trying to focus on different ways of perceiving those edges. So we're not just looking at the exterior, but the interior spaces. This also ties into the idea of the imaginary picture plane. The imaginary picture plane is something that exists on a piece of paper. So as an artist, as a two-dimensional artist, we are trying to take the three-dimensional world, meaning a space that has height, width, and depth, and put it onto a two-dimensional space, something that's flat. It has no depth. And artists during the Renaissance were really interested about this idea of the imaginary picture plane. They thought about art as a window to the world, and the term of the window had to do with that imaginary picture plane. If you go look out your window right now and you took a marker and I traced everything that I see on the window onto that out of the window onto that glass pane, I would have a perfect representation of the three-dimensional world that's been condensed to a flat two-dimensional pane. That's the idea of that picture plane. You're trying to flatten the world, and the glass plane does that to you. Artists in the Renaissance realized that the picture plane would actually be a helpful tool in creating an illusionistic representation of the three-dimensional world. So they created machines that would actually help them to do that. The first one is something called the Dürer machine. The Dürer machine was created by Albrecht Dürer. He's part of the Northern Renaissance movement, and he used this machine to help artists flatten that picture plane. You can see it's essentially a grid with a bunch of pieces of thread drawn along it, and he's got the exact same grid on the paper in front of him. Here's some examples of it today. Artists still use the drawer machine today because it's a helpful tool. It's a way to help you understand the three-dimensional world and how shapes and spaces change when they're flattened. So what we are going to do is create a version of one of these drawer machines. They're called viewfinders. And before we start our next project, that's what you're going to have to do. You're going to have to create a viewfinder that we're going to use for our next project. Now, the instructions for the viewfinder I posted below in a PDF. You can walk through it step by step, but you are essentially going to create two L shapes. The best thing to use for these L shapes is some kind of uh, harder cardboard, but not like super hard cardboard like a cardboard box. You want to use like a cereal box or like a box that your oatmeal is in, that kind of like not super hard, thick cardboard, but kind of that thinner cardboard that are used for those types of boxes. You want your two L shapes to be at least 3 inches. Preferably, I'd try to make them more like 6 on each side. That way you've got a little bit of wiggle room. You're going to connect them together with 2 paper clips. If you can't find paper clips, you can also use that blue tape from your kit. And once you have those viewfinders, you can start on the next project, which is your thumbnail sketches.